Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Sri Banerjee, core faculty for the College of Health Sciences and Public Policy at Walden University with a joint faculty appointment at Ross University School of Medicine. And I wanted to talk about Mahatma Gandhi, and today is his birthday, so I wanted to celebrate him, but also talk about some of his legacy, good and bad. And I think today is a good day to talk about all of that. His full name was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, and of course, no relation to the later Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. They actually are not related at all. But this is the man, and then his legacy. So there's the man himself. Mahatma is just epithet, which is designating individuals who have an elevated soul. It's not a first name like many people think. He actually was, his movements were an inspiration to the later civil rights movement, and what's of Martin Luther King Jr. And his civil disobedience was inspired by this, and that can be reflected in the "I Have a Dream" speech by him, by Martin Luther King. Gandhi led the country to freedom, of course, through his famous teachings of ahimsa, or nonviolent protest. Very important set of teachings which are practiced in various countries. And he led a very simple life. I actually visited his house, had the opportunity to do so, and actually saw the place of the spinning wheel. But Gandhi, he created the symbol of the spinning wheel, which became the centerpiece of the current Indian flag. So there's the Indian flag on the right, and as you can see, the spinning wheel. And I'll show you the picture of the spinning wheel that I saw. But during his nonviolent protests, he would be imprisoned, and during imprisonment, the main contribution is that he would fast until the demands were met. And of course, because he was such a famous figurehead, that was met by individuals protesting. So he was successful in that. He also led something called the Satyagraha, and actually the Satyagraha was the crux of his teachings, and this and ahimsa, these were some of the fundamental parts of his teaching. And so if you want to find out more, he had actually been trained in England and practiced law for a little bit in South Africa. He knew the law, he knew the British law, but he wasn't a very good student in law school, and maybe there's an incongruity between cultures, but he could speak and write English very well. So when he went back to India for his training, he actually had applied this Satyagraha principle to South Africa, and to bring more rights for Indians and provide provide the movement. Of course, it didn't succeed in South Africa, but he was able to mold and change this around. Satyagraha in Devanagari script is on the right here, but holding firm to truth, which is not quite truth, but holding firm to truth, which is in a way a belief. It's a particular form of nonviolent resistance or civil resistance. It was followed by Nelson Mandela, even in the fight against apartheid. Of course, for Gandhi, South Africa was a test group for Satyagraha, created by Gandhi, applied this model to India later successfully, and the principles and rules became the inspiration of the American civil rights movement. One of the things I wanted to talk about is that he promoted intercaste marriages. Um, he to uplift the plight of untouchables and people on the lower caste, and was instrumental in trying to bring all of the caste levels together. Events now leading up to partition. So this was his legacy, his nonviolence movement. But then there are portions of his life and portions during his life that there were some controversial situations. So the problem was when partition finally took place, there was a condition with the partition that there would be two nations, and this, there were several reasons for this, and we have to go back to 1920. So this was taking place in independence took place in 1947, and then so this was leading up to it, and the last time that the two groups worked together, the Khilafat and Swaraj, which Khilafat was the Muslim independence movement, and Swaraj was the self-rule Hindu version of that. And these groups, they were comprised of Hindus and Muslims who were friends. In fact, Gandhi was friends with a lot of the Muslim individuals and vice versa. But as the next decades were evolving, there was not enough attempt to make all sides work together, and they were moving separate, more separate, year by year. At the end, the extremists got their way. The Hindu extremists made way for a separate Hindu nation. There were, and I wanted to bring this up, there were pre-existing caste and communal violence, but many times this could have been resolved in a way that all groups could agree. And you see evidence of violence all over the world, but people should not take up arms for that. The concept that Muslims were militia or unclean was used along with Hindus in lower caste. So there was along socioeconomic lines. It was many different things. So religious division, pre-existing religious divisions could have led to reform and further disobedience. All groups needed to be treated with equality and respect. So I can't read the whole Quit India speech, but it was one of Gandhi's famous speeches, and I wanted to read at least part of it to try to understand the motivations and just the spirit of what was what he experienced. So there's a introduction to this, and then ours is not a drive for power, but purely a non-violent fight for India's independence. In a violent struggle, a successful general has been often known to effect a military coup and to set up a dictatorship. But under the Congress scheme of things, essentially non-violent as it is, there can be no room for dictatorship. A non-violent soldier of freedom will covet nothing for himself. He fights only for the freedom of his country. The Congress is unconcerned as to who will rule when freedom is attained. The power, when it comes, will belong to the people of India, and it will be for them to decide to whom it placed in the entrusted. May be that the reins will be placed in the hands of the Parsis, for instance, as I would love to see happen. Or they may be handed to some others whose names are not heard in the Congress today. It will not be for you then to object, saying this community is microscopic, that party did not play its due part in the freedom struggle, why should it have all the power? Ever since its inception, the Congress has kept itself meticulously free of the communal taint. It has thought always in terms of the whole nation and has acted accordingly. I know how imperfect our ahimsa is and how far away we're still from the ideal. But in ahimsa there is no final failure or defeat. I have faith, therefore, that if, in spite of our shortcomings, the big thing does happen, it will be because God wanted to help us by crowning with success unremitting sadhana for the last 22 years. So this is part 2. I believe that in the history of the world there has not been a more genuinely democratic struggle for freedom than ours. I read Carlyle's French Revolution while I was in prison, and Pandit Jawaharlal has told me something about the Russian Revolution. But it is my conviction that inasmuch as these struggles were fought with the weapon of violence, they failed to realize the democratic ideal. In the democracy which I have envisaged, a democracy established by nonviolence, there will be equal freedom for all. Everybody will be his own master. It is to join a struggle for such democracy that I invite you today. Once you realize this, you will forget the differences between the Hindus and Muslims, and think of yourselves as Indians only, engaged in the common struggle for independence. Then there's the question of your attitude towards the British. I have noticed that there is a hatred towards the British among the people. The people say they are disgusted with their behavior. So in this part of the speech, he goes on to say how there should not be hatred for any group. What are the other controversial portions? Well, in some instances, some authors hold Gandhi responsible for not having Jinnah Nehru, Jawaharlal Nehru come and Muhammad Ali Jinnah to come to an agreement about how India would be after independence. Was it going to be United India with modern-day Pakistan and Bangladesh included, or would there be two separate countries? And so these were the political discussions that were taking place, but somehow the people got left out because the leaders were dividing up the country. And the people it was actually concerning were left out, and the communal violence and pogroms were taking place in these small communities, and so there needed to be much more done and much better negotiations. As part of the condition of independence, part of the pact that there would be a Hindu India and a Muslim India, known as Pakistan. And the reason I feel so passionate about this is because I've seen multiple movies about the period leading up to the partition, and actually read some books, many books, multiple books about this time period. It provides insight as to why some of the modern violence takes place for instance, the one that took place in 2003 in Gujarat. So the partition was known as the Cripps Plan. Partition was viewed as a temporary solution, and that somehow magically, once the imperialists left, everything would be back to normal. This is what people believed. Gandhi was assassinated and nationalists took over and tore India and shredded it to pieces. All of the nonviolence was over suddenly. Ahimsa went out the door, and enormous amounts of violence ensued. And Gandhi was frustrated. And I'll tell you more about this. But he just said, "Let British leave India to anarchy." He could not, rather than as a cockpit between two organized armies. So it was a lost cause, and the violence was inevitable. A little bit more on the controversy. It's not that this was something that was going on for a long time. In fact, Hindus and Muslims had syncretic religions, and in the Mughal courts and the court systems, Babur, Akbar, and in fact Shah Jahan specifically created a new religion, a syncretic religion that had both Muslim faith and Hindu gods into one. Many of the gods were venerated from both sides. Some authors place the blame on the British strategy of divide and conquer that was going through the country, but there was also another movement of fascism, which was a part of India. Subhash Chandra Bose was the leader of fascism, Indian fascism, but the separatist movement was different than the fascism. However, more Muslims actually living in India than Muslim Pakistan. Gandhi, through his support with the Congress Party, which part of it was, some of it was controversial, non-violence had turned to communal violence and further separatism. Here's the spinning wheel that I had seen, and this was in located in his house. A civil war ensued. The effect, many people after the partition were refugees. Some people have said that millions of people died. Unimaginable war atrocities were committed during the war, during partition, especially to women and children. And he was assassinated by a Hindu extremist. His name was Nathuram Godse, and I believe Gandhi had between the 30s and 40s had about 6 attempts to his life. There was actually a quote I'm going to leave you with. What was going on with all this extremism? Well, on one hand, there were individuals that were wanting to remain a part of India. Many Hindus and Muslims were uprooted from their homes as a result of partition. They didn't want that in places where they had coexisted for almost 1,000 years when the Mughal Empire was created. What was interesting in the first war for independence in the 1850s, and I call this that, and many people call this that, Mangal Pandey was able to create a strong coalition between Hindus and Muslim kings without dividing the religions. This was a united fight against the British. But then, of course, religious fervor combined with nationalism led to the Civil War that few people talk about and emphasize, with some people saying, I'm not sure that this is actually true and correct, but in certain instances was siding with the Hindu side. He actually stayed at Noakhali, where Hindus were killed. Many Hindus were killed there. But there were subsequent riots in various places, even in Uttar Pradesh, where many Muslims were killed, and there needed to be more. However, before he was able to make amends and be able to stop the violence, he was assassinated. So again, one of the bloodiest examples of communal violence now officially was in Noakhali, Bangladesh, where 5,000 people died. And this is a significant number, and mostly Hindus. And this was seen as a Zamindar revolution. You can go into that. There's a lot of history behind the Zamindars and suppression against Muslims. Most of them were landowners, vast landowners, who suppressed people of lower socioeconomic status and Muslims. So this was seen as a revolution. However, it was tragic because it was along religious lines, and some of the communal violence then spread to Bihar and some of the neighboring cities, Kolkata and a lot of different places. Not only that, so the outgoing and newly appointed government was unable to extinguish the flame of hatred, in which hundreds of lives, actually more, thousands, and some people say millions, from both Hindu and Muslim communities. Government of Bengal press was asked to deliberately suppress the news of the riots and the casualties. So this type of deliberate suppression of the press prevented anybody from knowing actually what was going on. And trust and believe, a lot worse was going on the ground than anybody reported. Gandhi tried to stop the Noakhali riots, but he couldn't do much. He went there on foot and tried to talk with leaders, but they wouldn't have it. By the end, they were putting mud in the path of where Gandhi would walk, and he had to leave. So as I was saying, riots led to more riots. In Gurumukteshwar, India, there was riots where Hindu pilgrims killed 2,000 Muslims, and the police looked away. There was also a lot of volunteering groups that were creating semi-militaristic organizations behind the scenes, who were contributing to these riots. So, of course, there was the 1946 riots. One other thing that was going on globally was that there was the gradual continuation of the development of nation states, and so religious nationalism was on the rise all over the world. Another thing that happened was the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and with it the Khilafat movement. So there was this idea that nationalism would lead to freedom, but this global movement collapsed, and the nation states created identities surrounding the majority population. So it may be religious majority population, it may be racial majority population, it may be any number of things. But all over the world, minoritized populations have been discriminated against. So this is something that needs to be reckoned with and understood better. And I thought that there was no better time and to be talking about communal violence than on his birthday. Ironically, and the modern fervor on nationalism has grown so much to the point that some places wanted to elevate Nathuram Godse as a hero. And this is the most alarming thing I've ever heard. So this is the final quote that I'm going to end with. If I'm to die by the bullet of a madman, I must do so smiling. God must be in my heart and on my lips. And if anything happens, you're not to shed a single tear. Thank you for listening.